Started. My name is Don Harris. I'm the communications director for the Southeast Conference, and I have the pleasure of introducing Reverend Dr. Rachael Keefe. She's the author of the Lifesaving Church, Faith, Communities, and Suicide Prevention. That was published a couple of years ago by Chalice Press. She's also the pastor of Living Table UCC in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And she's an advocate for better mental health and understanding, better mental health understanding in our faith communities. So, Reverend Dr. Keefe, if I can hand it over to you and let you take it away.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for choosing to spend a part of your morning here learning about mental health and WISE. I like to begin my workshops by asking you what questions you bring or what you hope I will discuss during this time together, because I can tell you lots of things, but if it's not what you're needing to hear, it's not helpful. So if you have specific questions or topics that you hope I will cover, I encourage you to share them now. And if you want to share your name and anything else about yourself, if you serve a church, if you attend a church, things like that, so we can know a little bit more about each other.
Hi, Rachel. I'm Valerie Colauder. And I was really excited to know that you were going to be a speaker doing this, because I thought that your book was tremendously helpful. One angle that I think is very critical and probably even less resources is specifically dealing with children and youth with respect to mental health. Very often it is at those young ages that some severe mental health does manifest. Problems manifest, and kids, it's just such a truism. Kids can be cruel, and the deep insecurity of an identity at that age, makes it even more difficult to be a kid with mental health issues or in a family with mental health issues. And so I would really like to know, point in a direction where that, help might be.
Okay. Cindy, you had your hand up. You were being very polite. Go for it.
I was trying to unmute. Thank you. So I have a passion for this and an understanding at a level that some folks may not have. And so my enthusiasm is at a different level often than the congregation I'm serving. What is a good way to bring them along in a positive way to show them that WISE is a valuable component within the UCC and how to bring it to the church or the space that I'm serving?
Okay.
Can I also ask, for our church, we're in a retirement community. The biggest issue, mental health issue we have here is, dementia and, aging issues with mental health. And we have, couples where the spouse is trying to care for their spouse that happens to have these aging issues and mental health issues in that area. That is predominantly the issue, at least for our church. So if there's any helpful, ideas on that, that'd be great.
Okay. Others?
I'm happy to just to introduce myself, even though I don't have specific questions, but I'm Anita Hallenstein. I'm a psychologist and a UCC clergy person, so quite obviously interested in the intersection of mental health and spirituality and church life. So yes. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, there are not many of us who walk in both worlds, so it's nice to meet a fellow traveler.
Good to meet you.
My name is Kathy George. I'm an associate pastor at a UCC church in Huntsville, and my secular job is with the Mental Health Center So I'm the residential director for group homes in 3 counties and also the probate court liaison for 3 counties. So I am very interested in taking our church forward as far as mental health and being accepting of people and how to deal with folks that come in.
Great. Thank you. You also walk in both worlds. Dorinda?
Okay, I'm Dorinda Broadnax, and I'm pastor of community of First Congregation. I keep saying community because I'm in Montgomery, but First Congregational United Church of Christ in Birmingham. And of course, I'm hoping that I can get insight on when it is appropriate and when perhaps you're not overstepping your boundaries, when you make referrals for someone who needs assistance to someone else within the congregation. I think that's very important, and I want to be able to recognize those boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Those are important boundaries. And depending on the community you serve, people could be more or less offended if you recommend therapy, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that.
And I'm Marcia Bentley from First Congregational Church in Birmingham, Dorinda's church. And although academically my field was psychology, but I ended up being in social work for 42 years. And one of the things that I did was I was a trainer, and one of the things that I did was train social workers on how to refer for mental health treatment. But I first learned about WISE congregations at the AM21 conference last year and was fascinated by it. I was so glad that the UCC was getting involved. And I want to know how becoming a WISE congregation can be, I want to know the practical side of becoming a WISE congregation.
Like how to?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That I can do. All right. Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet want to go ahead?
Good morning. I'm Eugenia Whitlock, and I worship at Pilgrimage United Church of Christ in Marietta, Georgia. I'm a member in discernment, and I'm also the conference moderator. In my day job, I'm a department chair at a local university. So my interest in being here is there have been a few of us at Pilgrimage who have talked about becoming a WISE congregation. And, COVID just kind of put the halt on anything that's, new for us. And so that's why I'm here.
Okay, great. All right. Is that everyone? Sally, if you're with us and you want to share anything, feel free to do so now. I think you're the only one who hasn't. All right, I'm not hearing anything and I'm not seeing the mute come off. So, all right, all of the things that you mentioned are critically important depending on where your church is at or where the community you serve or attend is at. We have an hour and 15 minutes total, so we may not get through all of these things, but you are welcome to contact me if you want to have further conversation. Here we have something in chat, so let me, Kirkwood UCC is a WISE church, and I'm sure that we will welcome questions about the process. Great. There are about 34 WISE congregations in existence. Not all of them are UCC. There's at least one Presbyterian and I think 2 synagogues, but there 34 is the unofficial count. Full disclosure, I am no longer part of the Mental Health Network. Our bylaws say that we can only serve 2 consecutive terms of 3 years each. And since I served on the Mental Health Network prior to it having bylaws, I served for a total of 11 years, most of them as vice chair. So I had to take a year off. So I am not in the inner circle anymore, though the WISE process has not changed so much that I don't know what it is. And I am still the liaison for a few churches who are in the WISE process. So I have regular contact with the WISE team from the Mental Health Network, just so everybody's clear. I don't want to mislead anyone unintentionally. So usually I begin first by talking about why congregations are reluctant to look at the WISE process, why they are reluctant to engage in the mental health conversation. And I'm not one to talk at you for an hour and 15 minutes, so I invite engagement. And if you have questions at any time, you're welcome to raise your hand or wave or simply unmute yourself and ask. That's how I work best, and you will get less bored. So the reason that congregations or settings in which you have clergy operating as chaplains or advocates or whatever is because mental health has not really been dealt with successfully in the history of church, right? So when you think of mental illness and faith, what immediately comes to mind? Like, what were you taught as a child? What are the assumptions people make that go unchecked? What is it that people believe about mental illness that prevents us from engaging fully in the conversation? There's no wrong answer here, folks. You hide it. Yes, it's something that is taboo. You don't talk about it. Yep. What else?
Avoiding it.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I was raised to believe that if you just prayed and studied your Bible and turned to God in the church, that God would take care of it.
Yeah, you can pray it away. Yep. And if you don't, it's your fault. Yeah. If your mental health condition does not go away after you've prayed, it's a flaw in you. Yep. You don't have enough faith. Yeah. What else? Anybody ever heard that mental illness is possession by demons? Punishment for sin? Yeah. Those things and more are why even progressive congregations don't engage in the conversation. It is my firm belief that theology unchecked creates these biases. So even though people will say things like, I don't believe in demons, when someone they know has a psychiatric crisis and is diagnosed with a severe mental illness, they revert to these things that are out there in the milieu, which I refer to as the puritanical preset, are unchecked theological assumptions that govern how we do things. And so what we want to do with the WISE process is bring those assumptions to light and show just how full of nonsense they are. Because, most people in the UCC are reluctant to say that demons exist at all, let alone can possess someone. We don't really believe intellectually that God punishes us for sin. And we don't really believe that you can pray illness or certain conditions away, right? But when you scratch the surface, people believe it. It's kind of like, now I have been a pastor for almost 30 years, and I lead Bible study in such a way that I am always saying we don't take this literally. So how might we interpret this? And I've explained all kinds of reasons why we don't take the Bible literally. I've introduced them to Brian McLaren's really beautiful description of the use of scripture and how that has changed over time and what that means for congregations, all of these things. And a year ago, I preached on the passage where God sends serpents into the desert and the Israelites who get bit by them die. And I talked about what all of this meant from the perspective of the Israelites, why it was recorded this way, all of this stuff. And then 3 people after the service said, why would God do that to them? So even though we have processed again and again and again that we don't take the Bible literally, the default setting, the puritanical preset, is taking the Bible literally. So that mental health is a taboo, and we have all of these unexamined assumptions about it. is not a big surprise, because it makes us uncomfortable to talk about mental illness, because every single one of us knows someone who has a mental illness. If it's not ourselves, it's someone, according to NAMI, that 1 in 5 adults is diagnosed with a mental health condition every year. 1 in 5. The World Health Organization says 1 in 4. So somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people is diagnosed with a mental health condition every year. That's just adults. We're not even talking about people under the age of 18. And so everyone knows someone who has a mental health condition. And most of us know someone with what is called a severe and persistent mental illness. And then an interesting tidbit is that pandemic has made the diagnosis of anxiety go from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3. So people who did not experience anxiety acutely before pandemic have experienced anxiety acutely since. Anxiety and depression are on the rise. There's lots of reasons for that. But this isn't a workshop on why mental health exists or mental illness exists. The other thing to keep in mind is that mental health is a continuum, right? It goes, so how many of you know someone who is 100% mentally healthy? Exactly. No one. Not a single one of us can say, I know someone who is perfectly balanced mental health. Doesn't exist. Some of us lean more toward mental health. Some of us lean more toward mental illness. And all of us probably have experienced someone who is acutely ill with a mental health condition. The good news is that most mental illnesses respond to treatment, right? And treatment consists of a variety of things. It's not just therapy or just medication or just social support. It really takes at least those 3 things for someone to maintain wellness and recovery. And that's where the church comes in, right? We could provide social support, a social network, where persons with mental health challenges are full participatory members of the congregation, regardless of their mental health challenge. Now, that does not mean that you give someone who has an untreated delusional disorder a position of officer in your church, right? That would just be irresponsible. However, someone who has a severe mental health condition but is stable could certainly serve in a position in the church, so long as it was not triggering for them, because sometimes stress makes mental health challenges worse, right? Stress makes everything worse. So you want to be careful. But the goal of W.I.S.E is, welcoming, inclusive, supportive, and engaged for persons with mental illness. That means across the spectrum. So one of the questions is, well, how do we do that? Now, the funny part for me is the first step in the W.I.S.E process is talk to your pastor, talk to the clergy person responsible for your congregation or community. And half the time, it's the clergy wanting to bring this to their congregation. So I add, talk to your leadership. Try to get your leadership on board with why this is important. And there's a few ways you can do that. You can show them videos from one of the W.I.S.E conferences. There's, I think, 4 of them that have all the videos recorded. And this workshop is also being recorded. So you have some options, or you can just do a book study. There's some great books out there. We recommend starting with Sarah Lunn's Blessed Are the Crazy. It's a really good introduction to mental health, church, and the journey through it. Sarah's just come out with a new book that, by the way, I recommend for clergy to read. It's Blessed Union. It's talking about mental health in marriage. It's an essential read for anybody who is doing premarital counseling, preparing couples for marriage, performing marriage ceremonies. That's an aside. And so then after your council or group of leaders has read Blessed Are the Crazy, Then I would recommend my book, The Lifesaving Church, which is a little deeper into dealing with mental health. And if they're still not on board, there's other books to read. But usually after reading Sarah's book and having some conversation, people are like, we should do something about this in our congregation, and are then ready to explore the WISE process. It can be a very slow process. How many of your churches have gone through open and affirming? The WISE process is loosely based on the ONA process, meaning that we don't say these are linear steps. You must do these in order. We don't say that. And there's no time limit. There are some churches I've worked with here in Minnesota that they are 3 years into the WISE process and they haven't written their covenant yet. Because talking about mental health, mental illness brings out a lot of fear in your congregation. Living Table, for example, one of the reasons I chose to come here is that I had previously been serving as a clinical chaplain at a state hospital. And it was the first congregation that I didn't have to explain to them the benefits of having been a clinical chaplain at a state hospital to being a pastor. I didn't have to explain that at all because they already recognized that a lot of their folks struggled with mental health challenges and addictions. So we had a disproportionate number of people in recovery or living with mental health issues. Now I have to read the chat here. Yes. Yes, people usually ask about becoming wise when they've had an encounter with someone with a mental health issue. But we want to be proactive rather than reactive. So we encourage congregations to explore this before there is a crisis or a difficult situation. Where was I? Go back. I don't remember where I was. Sorry. Awareness allows us being proactive. So we want congregations to recognize that there are only benefits to becoming wise. There are no drawbacks, but the fear, that's where I was. The fear comes out of the woodwork. So Living Table, they have this active mental health ministry. We partner with NAMI to have an LGBTQ depression bipolar support group. So this was all in place before I got there. And about 3 years into my stay here, folks were like, well, you travel all over the country pre-pandemic talking about mental health issues. Why are we not a wise congregation? I'm like, well, that's a really good question. Why are we not a wise congregation? So then we went through the process. And during that process, even at Living Table, people came up to me and said, we don't want those people in our congregation. They're dangerous. So that's the number one myth that needs to be busted. Well, number two, if if it's punishment for sin or demon possession, that's up there. But the really important thing to dismiss, fix, correct, get rid of is that people with severe and persistent mental illness are violent. The media has us convinced that everyone who has schizophrenia or a delusional disorder or experiences psychosis of any kind is dangerous. That is simply not true. People with mental health challenges are much more likely to be a victim than they are to be violent toward others. They are more likely to be violent toward themselves than they are to be violent toward others. So dispelling that myth means, shattering the stigma and breaking the silence. The more we normalize mental health conditions, the less likely people are to respond in fear. And there are some easy ways to normalize that don't take a lot of stress. Like, how many of you in your worship services have a time when you share joys and concerns? Right? Out loud. Now, at Living Table, it is not uncommon for someone to say something like, please pray for me today. I am having thoughts of suicide. Now, if that were to happen in congregations unprepared, you would hear the giant gasp because somebody said suicide, implying that they are imminently suicidal. That would freak out most congregations. At Living Table, the response is, yes, we will pray for you. And then after worship, a couple of people will check in with that person. I'm very lucky to have retired psychiatric nurses as part of my congregational care team. It's very helpful. If you have those in your congregation, you want them on your congregational care team. And they will go and check in with this person and ask the appropriate questions to find out what we need to do to make sure this person can get through the next 24 hours. But there is not panic. There is only prayer and the appropriate level of concern. So normalizing mental health conditions through prayer requests, because, we refer to mental illness as the illness without a casserole, right? Somebody's hospitalized for almost any other condition. You go to their house, you bring them food, you check in, you pray for them, you do all the things. Someone has a mental health challenge or someone in their family is hospitalized for mental illness. A, we don't talk about it. B, we don't treat it like any other illness. We don't bring casseroles. We don't bring desserts. We don't bring anything. In fact, we avoid them like the plague. And that's because of the misconception of what causes mental illness. Do you know what causes mental illness? We will not laugh at your answer, I promise. Do you know what the cause of mental illness is?
Chemical imbalance.
Chemical imbalance, something in the brain.
Sometimes abuse.
Brain chemistry.
Yeah. Sometimes abuse of some sort.
Trauma.
Trauma, yeah. Trauma. Yeah.
Genetics. Huge piece of mental health issues are genetics. Genetics, environment, brain injury, traumatic brain injury. And the natural aging process for some people causes dementia, which is a brain disorder. So all of this is to say that it is biological. Even those who develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of trauma, have measurable changes in their brains. PET scans show us that the brain of someone who has PTSD is different.
I got my cell phone.
I'm going to mute. There we go. The brain of someone with PTSD is different than someone without. The brain of someone who has an eating disorder is different than the brain of someone without. The brain of someone with an addiction is physically different than someone without. That is true for most mental health conditions, that there are places in the brain that are measurably different. I am not a neurologist or a neuropsychiatrist, so I cannot be more specific than that, but I've read the studies. I've gone to trainings. This is absolute truth. So all mental health conditions, even those that we say are acquired rather than innate, cause changes in the brain. So they are all brain disorders, diseases, however you want to put that. Meaning they are 100% biological. Just like cardiac disease, diabetes, cancer, 100% biological. Yes. And what makes recovery and wellness challenging, particularly in the category of addictions, and I put things, eating disorders, sex addiction, drugs, alcohol, and even some self-harming OCD type behaviors can slide into that addiction category. The brain gets good at doing what it does. So if you develop this repeated pattern to stress or whatever it is, your brain gets really good at that. And it's very challenging to create new neural pathways, which is why sustained recovery is challenging, particularly in the early days, because the brain is really good at doing what it does. And I know that personally. I had an eating disorder in my adolescence. And even now, when I am stressed, my brain immediately goes to ways I can lose weight, where I can cut calories, where I can exercise more, what I can do to lose weight. Now, I don't act on those thoughts anymore. Those thoughts come up, I realize, okay, there's some area in my life I am not attending to because this tells me I am stressed. So the brain gets good at doing what it does. And that's a challenge with mental health issues. The other challenge is that some people have a condition called anosognosia that co-occurs with their mental illness. It's a symptom of the mental illness, and it means they are incapable of knowing. It literally translated means not knowing. So for some people, it's common with people who have certain types of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, things that often involve psychosis or mania. They don't realize how ill they really are. They think that we are the crazy ones for wanting them to take medications. They're not being obstinate, right? They're not doing this for fun. They really don't know that they're ill. And so to get these people into treatment, you have to find the proper motivation. Do you want to finish college? You must take this medication. Do you want to see your child? You must take this medication, be in this treatment program. And it's really, really hard. It's not super common, but it's not super uncommon either. So let's see. How are we doing with time? Okay, we're doing okay. So questions on the nature of mental illness to this point, because now I want to shift to talk more about W.I.S.E and congregational responses, but I want to check in and see if there's questions about mental illness at this point. It's a rapid tour through Mental Health 101. The important thing, you don't need to be a diagnostician. You don't need to know what diagnosis someone carries to be helpful. What you need to know is this is a biological disorder. This is not something someone chooses, does to themselves, God does to them. It's a biological disorder as much as cancer is a biological disorder. If that's all you take from this workshop, I'll be pleased. Because that means we can respond to mental illness the same way we respond to any other kind of illness. And if we could get our insurance companies to respond to mental illness in the same way they respond to other kinds of illness, we'd be doing really well. But the puritanical influence remains strong. That disparity between healthcare and mental health care is a result of our puritanical roots. So all this is to lead up to saying that our congregations can do a much better job in welcoming, including, supporting, and engaging with persons with mental illness, because everyone has a place in the church, right? Those of you who've read my book know that I have an as with one, so with all theology. And some of you are like, huh? That means if one of us has schizophrenia, the body of Christ has schizophrenia. If one of us is suicidal, the body of Christ is suicidal. There is no us and them. They are us, we are them. And if we can get our congregations to that place, then we have reached truly a wise place to be. It's a long and slow trudge because the rest of the world wants us to be fearful of people with mental health challenges. And sometimes they can be scary because you don't know what they're going to do or what's going on in their heads. However, keep in mind, rarely does someone with a severe and persistent mental illness become violent. So how do we get our congregations on board? We start by introducing mental health issues in prayer time. If you're a pastor, then you may know who is in your community that would be willing to ask for prayers regarding mental health issues. And these days, there's not much taboo asking for prayers for depression or anxiety, right? Many people having experienced depression and anxiety over the last several months. So if you know who those people are, or perhaps they have a family member who is having a mental health crisis or lives with ongoing mental health challenges, and everybody's okay with it, you could ask them to ask for prayers for that person. That's the most benign way to introduce the idea that mental health conditions are normative into a congregation, is through the prayer time. And then as people become more comfortable, perhaps some folks will come forward and ask what else they can do. If not as leaders, sometimes a gentle nudge from the pastor or one of the church officers will get people thinking, oh, we can do more. Let's form a WISE team. Let's form a team of people who are going to look at how we can move our congregation further into this dialogue around mental health. And you will find much help at the Mental Health Network's website. So I'm going to put it in chat so everybody can see it. So, and they have a beautiful booklet on how to become wise with the 10 steps laid out very clearly. But really what you want to do is start introducing mental health concepts, please excuse Sophie, into the congregation. And you do that through these safer avenues: prayer, gentle conversations with some leaders that might provoke them to want to form a WISE team, or do a book study on mental health. And again, I recommend starting with Blessed Are the Crazy. Most people can read that book and have sympathy and realize where our congregation still falls short on dealing with mental health. Yes, general prayers are helpful for those dealing. I often include prayers for those dealing with mental health conditions, or those who are struggling with thoughts of suicide, or those who are living with addictions. You can do that. It brings it home closer if there's a person or two in your congregation who are willing to ask for prayers specifically for themselves or a family member, because people tend to kind of dismiss those general prayers because it doesn't apply to them. Right. So the closer you can bring it to home, the better. Did someone have a question? Go ahead.
Well, I actually had an experience of that. I posted a little bit earlier in the chat. In the congregation I grew up in when I was a teenager, the pastor that was there had a child with mental health, mental challenges that was actually institutionalized. And when we did the call process, most of the rest of the congregation didn't know it. I don't know if the pastoral call committee knew or not. But when it became known among us, we had gotten to know the pastor, and it was a hugely different response than if it had been just, some outsider coming. That it was somebody that we knew and respected, and we felt compassion and care rather than, oh, this is dangerous, or I'm scared of this, or, judgment.
Sometimes that works. I am living proof that sometimes that does not work. Sometimes it's the same with the open and affirming process. Sometimes if people have enough relationship of trust and someone comes out, then there's still love and support from the community. Sometimes not so much. And the same is true with mental health issues. Developmental disabilities fall into a different category. People who have developmental disabilities, people understand that is genetic or brain injury, and they tend to react with less fear, shame, stigma. There's still some shame and stigma because there's still some people who somehow believe it's contagious, and I don't understand that. But for the most part, there is a difference between developmental disabilities and mental health issues. And unfortunately, people who have developmental disabilities also can have mental health issues, which I think is vastly unfair in the grand scheme of the universe. I'm like, you should get a pass. You know, if you have Down syndrome, you shouldn't also have to deal with OCD and anxiety and early onset dementia, which are also common co-occurrences in Down syndrome. You know, it just, yeah, but nobody gets a pass. You know, mental illness knows no bounds. It does not differ by age, by gender, by economics, nothing, education. It just knows no bounds. So in disclosing to your congregation, if you as a pastor or you have children who have mental health issues, that's a judgment call that you need to make sure you're going to have support in your congregation. So maybe you start with your leaders before you tell the whole congregation, because fear and shame is huge when it comes to mental health issues. And we have a long way to go before we break that down, which is what the WISE movement is all about. We want to break the silence, shatter the stigma, normalize mental health conditions, because almost all of us have them. You know, I like to point out, I'm not a big fan of the DSM, the diagnostics, you know, the numbers, the coding that we use so the insurance company will pay the providers. But if you were to look at the DSM, things like caffeine addiction are in it. You know, so if you have to have your cup of coffee, you're sliding into caffeine addiction. Now, the criteria for caffeine addiction is pretty significant, but you're a step closer if you can't function without your coffee in the morning. You know, we're all in there in some way, shape, or form. It's just the question of severity. Like, many people have some OCD tendencies. Like, how many times do you need to check to make sure your alarm clock is set before you go to sleep at night? When you put gasoline in your vehicle, do you have to round it up to a whole number? Do you keep clicking that thing until it's a whole number, like a 0 or a 5? You know, how many times do you check to make sure you've turned off all the lights in the stove before you leave your house? Like, these are all in and of themselves mean nothing, except we're cautious people, or we don't trust technology in the case of the alarm clock. But when you group them together and they interfere with your daily living, then you have a mental health condition. And someone asked about dementia and aging, and I want to touch on that briefly because that is usually mentioned in WISE, but not directly addressed. So Living Table was really fortunate in that couple of things. My wife has some expertise in training for dementia, and the local Alzheimer's Association had a dementia-friendly church training that we did. So I would encourage you, and all churches should do this because none of us are getting any younger, to look into your area to see if there's an Alzheimer's Association or a Society on Aging, whatever it might be called, in your area, to see if there's dementia-friendly training available. And in these days on Zoom, you might have more options because cognitive impairment is cognitive impairment. Whether someone is confused easily because they have a traumatic brain injury, they have developmental disabilities, they are in an altered state due to substances, or they're experiencing psychosis or mania, or they have dementia. It doesn't matter. The things you do to make your church dementia friendly will help with those who have cognitive impairment, regardless of what the cause is. You know, it's in some ways simple things like signage that is clear signage. Like in the building that Living Table is in the process of moving out of, as you walk in, we had stairs that go up and go down. So posted is a sign that says office, and it goes up, meaning go up the stairs. But if you're someone who has some cognitive impairment, you're going to stand there in the vestibule and stare at the ceiling, wondering how to get up there. So clear signage is one of the things for dementia-friendly churches. Name tags is another one, which I find eminently helpful. All right. I'm looking at the chat here. All right. And it's not cooperating. Yes, mental health first aid is a good thing to do. Part of the process in WISE is a period of education. And that education can include things like book studies, can also include inviting mental health first aid, which is a really excellent course that sort of tries to remove some of the stigma and give a bit of knowledge so that you don't panic when you recognize someone has a mental health condition. It is really helpful and not terribly expensive. And these days it's also available online. So I strongly encourage you to do that. If your church is reluctant to engage in the conversation, mental health first aid is not your first stop, because you'll get 3 people to sign up and you'll end up being very frustrated. And I can also tell you that, at least in the beginning, talking about mental health, mental illness, mental health challenges is not going to draw a large crowd. I can't tell you how many times I have done workshops on mental health, WISE, suicide prevention, and been the lowest attended workshop at whatever it is that I'm doing. It's the conversation we most need to have that we are most reluctant to engage in. And so, again, WISE wants to end that. So I'm going to go through the 10 steps to become WISE, which again is on the Mental Health Network website. And they have a great booklet. You can download it. If you really want it in print, you can ask them to send some printed copies. They have some available. We had bunches printed when we were still doing things in person. So they are available in print if that is helpful. So the first step, as I mentioned earlier, is consult with your pastor or faith community leaders. So if you're the clergy, then you go to the community leaders. If you are a lay person, you talk to the pastor, because you want to make sure your pastor's on board, because especially in smaller churches, if the pastor's not on board, things don't happen. Step 2 is form a WISE team. That's a small group of people who are willing to figure out ways in which your church can engage in the education process, the conversation around mental health. Step 3, connect with the UCC Mental Health Network and check out the available resources. And there's a form on the UCC Mental Health Network page that you can fill out to let them know that you want to become WISE and are engaging in the process. Step 4 is decide to help the congregation vote to become WISE. And that is, that's the decision that is going to push you deeper into the process. And that might be when you have mental health first aid or the dementia friendly church workshop, or trauma informed congregations workshop, any kind of things like that, that will get more people educated and engaged in the conversation. Step 5 is draft your WISE covenant. And in some ways, this is the easiest thing to do, because you can copy the WISE covenant from any WISE congregation and adapt it to your setting. You do not have to reinvent the wheel. So if there are some examples of the covenants online, and you can take them, adapt them, make them your own. Let's see. Step 6, involve leadership in creating the WISE covenant. So you want buy-in across the church's leadership. This is not necessarily something that should come from the WISE team itself, but involve representatives across the leadership of the church. Step 7 is vote, come to consensus, however it is you make decisions in your congregation. Then step 8 is certify and celebrate becoming wise, which means you let the mental health network know that you have voted. They will send you a lovely certificate, and then you celebrate. And after celebrating, step 9 is publicize. Let the world know that you are now a WISE congregation and what that means. And step 10, turn to the future. And you can find these detailed in the booklet that is on the website. Lots of detail. And again, these are not necessarily linear steps. The things that you must do if you want to be certified is contact the mental health network as soon as you know that your congregation is going to engage in the WISE process, because you will have a liaison that will be able to answer your questions that may or may not be willing to do some training with your individual congregation. I have done lots of Zoom trainings with congregations over the last 18 months, and it looks just like this. and that's a possibility. So you must let the mental health network know. And to become WISE, you eventually need to create a WISE covenant and get that approved by the mental health network before you vote on it. Because there's some things that they're constantly evolving what this might look like. We've run into a couple of difficulties in years past where congregations wanted to certify that to become WISE, but they were still looking at LGBTQ folks as having a mental health condition. We can't certify you as WISE if you think LGBTQ folk have mental illness just because they're LGBTQ. So there is a caveat in there now that your congregation must be willing to make the statement that LGBTQ folks are not mentally ill for being LGBTQ. So that's why the mental health network needs to be connected into your process to make sure that these things that arise out of our experiences, such as thinking of being queer as being pathological, we want to make sure that there isn't a problem that you need to address before you can become WISE. All right. I know that was an equally rapid tour through becoming WISE, the steps. Other questions? I'll take questions on anything I've said so far, and then I'll look at some of the other questions we had at the beginning that I haven't talked about yet. Yes, Eugenia.
Hi. So any of the trainings in the early process of becoming a WISE congregation, you need to build awareness, congregation and leadership. So we can find that on the Mental Health Network website, resources for trainings and speakers.
Yes, there are recordings from 4 different WISE conferences. When we were able to be in person, we had them twice a year. And then we did one online, I think it was last fall. I don't know, time blurs together. And, or maybe it was last spring. Not sure when it was, but okay. So yes, those trainings are all online. You can look at, they're listed under video recordings of conferences. So you can go and there's all the different workshops that we provide at a WISE conference, including Mental Health 101 by whatever name. Somebody called it the Big 3. Someone else called it Mental Health 101. There's companionship, which is a great idea for congregations to have some folks who are trained in responding to people with mental illness to companion them through worship or meetings or such things. There's suicide prevention. There's how to start a spiritual support group. There's also how to become WISE, like an extended discussion of that. So there's lots of resources on the website. And so I would recommend starting there because you might find that there's something that your congregation would respond to very well. Book studies are often very helpful. As I said, I can't stress that enough because people can sort of read them at home and have their initial reaction without fear of other people judging them for their reactions. Because we can't always help what we react to, right? We all come with our own life experience that has taught us some weird stuff, quite honestly. So book studies often feel safe for folks. And depending on your context, there are resources. Like if you are serving a church that is predominantly people of color, the WISE program has a grant right now, or the Mental Health Network has a grant right now to look at the intersection between, what it means to be a person of color and also deal with mental illness, because traditionally, almost any culture has not dealt well with mental illness, but each culture has their own approach. Like traditional Black church has a very different approach to mental illness than traditional white church. And depending on where people are coming from, you want to be able to address that. And the reluctance to seek mental health support treatment for people of color is legitimate, because they're often dismissed as just problematic people rather than children or young adults having a mental health condition. So for people of color to seek out therapy and treatment, it is riskier because they're discredited, more so than women are discredited, and we're discredited enough. So keep that in mind. Like when I do suicide prevention training, I say, if you feel the need to call 911 and it is a person of color, make sure there is a white person there willing to bear witness, because police have an unfortunate history with people of color who have severe mental illness. So, I mean, that's just the reality of the world we live in right now. So there are resources for that as well. And I see in the chat, how much does WISE do in the area of addictions awareness, education, and ministry? A fair amount. There's always a training on addictions included in the WISE program. We would be remiss to do that. The UCC also has a harm reduction ministry, which is, there's an alternative to AA. Harm reduction is making it as safe as possible for people who are using, needle programs, things like that make it safer for people who are not ready to get their addictions treated. So WISE does address addictions. Often addictions co-occur with mental health conditions. I have never met a person in recovery from an addiction who didn't have an underlying mental health condition. Addictions are often self-medicating. I suppose there could be a person out there with some kind of an addiction that doesn't have an underlying mental health condition, but I've never met them. And I spent 6 years working as a psychiatric chaplain, and 5 years as an outpatient therapist, and 30 years as an ordained minister. Never met someone with an addiction who didn't have an underlying mental health condition, ranging from everything from anxiety to schizophrenia and various things in between. All right, so let's see. Children and youth mental health. This is always a challenge to find resources, because we often have a shortage of children's psychiatric beds in any given community. There's shortage of adult psychiatric beds too, but child psychology and psychiatry, fewer and fewer beds available for children if they have a severe issue. Most of the time, the difficulty with children and under the age of 10, I'll say, is that the mental health issues present themselves as behavioral. You get children who are out of control because they feel anxious, which turns into rage, which turns into unpredictable behaviors. And that also looks like ADD, and it looks like trauma response, and it looks like children are hard. It's hard to know what's happening with them because they're not accurate reporters, because they lack the life experience to be able to tell you what's going on in their brains. You take your best guess based on the behavior you see. And children who are out of control, there's a lot of shame and stigma. Parents are blamed. Sometimes it is the parents' fault because the parents are doing things that are just not helpful. Rarely is that 100% the case. Often what you have is parents who are ill-equipped to deal with children who have mental health challenges, and they just make the situation 10 times worse. But even so, it's not their fault. Most parents set out to do the best they can. The best they can may be woefully inadequate, but their desire is not to mess up their children. Very few parents have the desire to mess up their children. And if they have the desire to mess up their children, they're sociopaths. That's a whole different ball of wax. So children who are acting out make it challenging in Sunday school and worship. So what you want to do is to create as inclusive a space as possible. Like at Living Table, we created a space up front in the church with a table and chairs and fidget toys and crayons. And I created like self-stimulating bottles that had glitter and toys and things in them that as you turn them, you could see different things, like quiet toys that they could play with in the sanctuary during worship, because our kids are in worship. We also talked a lot about how it's okay if a child who is on the autism spectrum, say, wants to wander through church while worship is going on. Let it happen. They do no harm. If the child is making a ton of noise, then we ask the parents to step out into the next room where you can still see and hear everything. It's going to be a little different in our new space. I don't know how we're going to work that out, but and Living Table accepted that readily because we had plenty of adults who would get up in the middle of the worship and go refill their coffee. Very casual folks. So, when they would complain to me, I am a sort of very direct person, which in Minnesota isn't always welcome. So they would say, little Johnny is making too much noise and he's so distracting when he runs around the sanctuary, because we had one who would do laps around the sanctuary, which good for you. I wish I could do the same thing sometimes. People would complain. They say, it's so distracting. I said, so you forgetting to turn off your cell phone isn't distracting? Or you getting up to go refill your coffee 3 times during worship isn't distracting? You nudging your neighbor to point out something that somebody's wearing isn't distracting? I'd rather have the child doing laps around the sanctuary. Thank you. At least I know the child's doing laps around the sanctuary. So, it's normalizing behavior with kids and recognizing when a family might be in distress. In the back of my book is a checklist for referrals. So, a child and family therapist is in that list. Somebody who can deal with youth, someone who can deal with children, somebody who can deal with LGBTQ folks, like someone who is familiar with treating the aging population, and you have a place to put the name and number. So to fill out your referral list, which brings us to, how do you know when to make a referral? I think most of us know with gut instinct that something is not right. And if you, as the pastor, talk with that person a couple of times and you realize this is not a spiritual issue in and of itself, that's when you refer. I mean, the standard is you see a person 3 times. And if the issue can't be resolved in those 3 meetings, you refer elsewhere. Now, I tend to blur that line because of my background and experience. My policy is that I will not work with someone who is actively suicidal unless they have a therapist also, because I don't have malpractice insurance. I'm not willing to take that risk. And even though the person would tell me, I wouldn't blame you if I die by suicide. I'm like, you might not, but your family could. So I make sure that if somebody who is suicidal, they have a licensed therapist to work with as well. And I will still work on spiritual practices and spiritual health with them, which is a little bit different than getting at the core of whatever's troubling them. So yeah, learning the signs of this in pastoral care skills. Yes, it's important to recognize. I mean, most of us know when someone is mentally unwell. You can tell. If they don't flat out tell you, you can tell. Now, the trick to that is also people have the right to refuse treatment. Adults have the right to refuse treatment so long as they are not a danger to themselves or others and can take care of their daily needs. So that's a hard situation. I mean, we have someone at Living Table who is unmedicated for a mental health issue and is sometimes quite problematic. Does not have healthy boundaries, can be disruptive occasionally, but is someone well known to the congregation. So we are careful in dealing with this person. So, as long as they don't meet the criteria for hospital level of care, they have the right to refuse treatment as adults. And that can be very hard to watch, especially if somebody's engaging in self-destructive behavior. People have the right to be addicted to substances. Again, unless they are in imminent danger to themselves or others. If they threaten you, they threaten someone else, then you report them. You call 911 and see what happens. But again, if it's a person of color, make sure there is a white person there to bear witness, because our police officers do not have good track record with people of color with mental health issues. And I know that's not just in the Twin Cities. All right. Other things I have not talked about. We have about 5 minutes left by my clock. So other things that you have questions about, wished I had said something about, want to know more? I'm going to put my email in the chat. And this is just my personal email. It's not the church. So no one else will see this but me. If you have other questions or whatever as a result from today, that's just my personal email. No one else will see it. So feel free to be in touch if you want to.
If nobody has a question in regards to specifically to WISE, would you do a brief blurb or introduction to your most recent book?
Sure.
Thank you.
So my most recent book is called The Lifesaving Church, Faith Communities and Suicide Prevention. It is somewhat an autobiography, but mostly the purpose is to address the theology surrounding suicide. Because if you think the church is messed up in its views about mental illness, it is more messed up in its views around suicide on both sides of the theological divide. So I address the big concerns and the questions, is suicide a sin? If I die by suicide, will I go to hell? Those are the kinds of questions I address. I also give, it's all the as with one, so with all theology. So how to integrate that into a community, how to become a life-saving church, how to make space for people who are struggling with suicidality in a way that is safe, that allows for them to acknowledge this is how I'm feeling today and have that validated. So the important thing in any mental health ministry is that we validate people as beloved children of God, right? No matter who you are, no matter how you are, no matter what state of mental health you are in, you are God's beloved, and there is room for you in this congregation. You can only say that when you get to the point where it is true. Because you may remember the UCC ad campaign years ago that, whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. I was pastoring churches and I would get calls. So are we welcome at your congregation? No, I'm not even welcome at my congregation. So don't come here. So you want to make sure that you are not inviting people with mental health challenges into your congregation until the congregation is able to receive them. Like I have had phone calls at Living Table from group homes to see if their residents could come. And I say, of course, you are more than welcome, because they are. They will be welcome. They will be given a name tag. They will be invited to coffee. People will engage in conversation as much as that person is able to engage in conversation. So don't advertise actively that you are ready to be a life-saving church or a WISE congregation until you really are. Because you could seriously put people at risk. If they come to church thinking they're going to be welcomed and loved, and they are judged and shamed and feel rejected, that's a problem. All right, I need to look at chat again. Yeah, the question, this is a very risky thing. Exactly what you put in chat. Someone who has died by suicide, we don't say committed suicide because that's a value judgment. You know, people commit crimes. So it's a really tricky question. And the workshop on how to not contribute to suicidality and suicide death is a different workshop. But if you assure someone that the person who died by suicide is with God and at peace, you are increasing the likelihood that someone in the congregation who is listening will die by suicide. Think about it. And if you say that they're in hell and suffering forever, alone in hell, you're also increasing the likelihood that someone in the congregation will die by suicide so that that person is not alone in hell forever. It's a difficult place to walk and find the truth that is authentic, has integrity, and does not put anyone else at increased risk for suicide. My response is in the book, so read the book. If you want me to come and do that suicide prevention training at your church, I am happy to do so via Zoom these days. I'm not traveling yet. But if that's something you're interested in, please be in touch. And I believe we have 1 minute left.
Thank you very much. This was very informative.
You're welcome. You are most welcome. It was my pleasure to be here with you. And like I said, you're welcome to be in touch. Cindy has my contact information as well. So if you know Cindy, you can get to me if you forget what I put in chat here. My email is also in the book. So you can get the book and get my email too. So
thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Rachel, for providing such valuable content.
You're most welcome.
It's very helpful for everyone. We have an hour.